So here comes a little explanation of imperialism. Imperialism, as we've already said, is one of our ingredients for a world war. You get a little bit of nationalism and a little bit of imperialism, and that's what's going to take us to the events of 1914. So imperialism, by definition, essentially means the process of building an empire. You can kind of see the word empire hiding in there a little bit. So that's what we're going to see. We're going to see countries, mostly in Europe here, but the United States also plays a part, that want to expand their power and their wealth by taking over other countries. So this is something that is really going to pick up in the second half of the 1800s, but carry into the early part of the 1900s. And that rivalry and that nationalism is going to be one of the major factors of World War I. Okay, so we're going to be starting off here in Chapter 12, Section 1, and in a second you guys are going to be reading that. And I'd like you to think about these three things. Okay, here are the three focus things that you want to think about. What is imperialism? How did it drive Europeans to conquer from about 1850 to 1914? Remember, dates are never set in stone, with a few exceptions. We know that June 28th, 1914 is the moment World War I officially starts. But usually these eras are, kind of fluid around certain starting and ending dates. So we're focusing on the second half of the 1800s and early into the 1900s. Next thing I want you to think about as you read is to explain the four main reasons that Europeans had a desire to imperialize between those years. So what are the big reasons that are driving them to do this? Because it's certainly not cheap, and it's definitely going to be a headache. It's not easy to take over another country, usually far away from your own, and make them follow you. It's really tough. So why would they do that? The last thing you want to do is analyze different forms of imperialism that Europeans used between those years, including, here's a few I want you to be on the lookout for, spheres of influence, protectorates, and puppet states or satellites. They're very similar. So we're going to go ahead and pause now. You're going to have about 10 minutes to read Chapter 12, Section 1, and then I'm going to come back, okay, and explain the rest. So pause it. I'll be back in a minute. Hey, I'm back. Okay, so what is imperialism? I'm going to have a handout here in a second that you'll get, and that's going to explain the different types of imperialism. So this is a really famous political cartoon right here, and that is Cecil Rhodes, and he is stretching. The title of it is From Cairo to the Cape. So he's got 1 foot on Cairo, Egypt, and 1 foot on Cape Town, South Africa. And you can kind of see what he's trying to show, that they're going to take over pretty much the whole darn continent, right? Because that is kind of how Britain rolls. There's other countries involved too, and there's all different levels of imperialism. You might have indirect rule. You might have direct rule. So indirect rule is where the Europeans would actually keep an African in charge, but tell them a lot of what to do. So a puppet government is a great example of that. Direct rule is where a European would actually go to the colony to rule. So, side note, I want to show you a really interesting map here that I think, has a lot to do with our topic. So here it is. This is a great little article coming from the Telegraph in the United Kingdom. British have invaded 9 out of 10 countries, so look out, Luxembourg. So it's kind of weird, the countries they haven't invaded. A lot of them are really tiny, and it's more that they marched through them on their way to someone else that they'd rather spend time with. So you can see all of these countries at one point in time had British troops on the ground in their country. That's pretty amazing. Remember, we talked about just how significant that Industrial Revolution was, okay? If it starts anywhere else, what would this map look like? I tell you what, it would be a different country for sure that's marching around and taking over everyone. That's the significance of what that Industrial Revolution makes possible. So now, we're going to move forward here and talk about the different kinds of imperialism. But before we do that, we want to look at the motives of why Europeans wanted to conquer other nations. Okay, and you probably saw this in your reading. So there's economic interests. That's first and foremost going to be your biggest one. A lot of these countries are taking over these other places because they have a resource that the home country does not have. So if you can control that resource, you can run a monopoly here, you're going to make a lot of money. So we saw the British do that with the United States, right? Way back before we were even a country. Mercantilism drove our relationship with England. So that's going to be true here in Africa with the British in India. That's going to be true. There's economic interests are definitely a major motivation. Political and military motives, okay? You cannot be considered a world power at this point in the world without owning colonies. And that's going to be something that's going to be a little bit of a hard pill to swallow for especially the United States, because our country is a little late to this imperialism party. We are not part of the Berlin Conference. And so what our country is going to start to realize is that if we want to be considered a world power, we need to take over other places. This is kind of hard to think about considering we were once a country that was a colony. And there's going to be some people that really say this is not the direction the United States should go. However, the pressure is just going to be on some of our leaders in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And as much as they may not like it, and they'll say they may not like it, but they really feel like they have no other option. So when we look at McKinley's role in the Spanish-American War, we look at what President Roosevelt somewhat allows to happen in the Philippines, you're going to see it's not a popular decision by everyone in the United States, definitely not by the people being taken over. But it was one that a lot of leaders felt like they really had no alternative. Humanitarian and religious schools, there's going to be a general attitude by a lot of the Europeans that they were doing the right thing. They were doing a favor for the people they were taking over. We're going to read a poem by Rudyard Kipling called The White Man's Burden. And it basically says, look, it's our job and our duty as good Christians to civilize and Christianize these people who are clearly beneath the rest of us. So some of that was well intended, some of it not necessarily. Definitely, though, we want to remember that the people who are being taken over are really going to resent that. They're not going to want that the presence of the other country coming in. And then social Darwinism. So we talked about this at the end of the Industrial Revolution unit. Social Darwinism is the idea that, they're trying to apply something about plants and animals to people and say only survival of the fittest people survive. So it's something that has kind of been since debunked, but it's definitely a theory that is a big motivator back then. So the idea was, hey, we can show up to Africa and divide it all up. And hey, if they can't fight back against our well-trained and organized militia, then too bad, survival of the fittest. So you're going to see that be a justification for a lot of the things that happen, whether it's the United States and the Philippines, whether it's the British in India, the French in Indochina. That's a common justification. Okay, so a couple other kinds of imperialism that we're going to be seeing in the next few weeks. Annexation means to completely take over. So for instance, that's what the United States does in Hawaii. We take you over. We helped overthrow the Queen Liliuokalani, and took over Hawaii, annex it. Now, that's kind of your most extreme case. A satellite or a puppet state, there's my little puppets right there, that's when you still want to control it, but you don't want to necessarily take all of it for some reason. Maybe it's far away. Maybe you don't have as much money, but you still want to control. So you leave a local leader in control. But you tell that leader exactly what to say or do. So just like a satellite appears to float around aimlessly in space and a good puppet appears to talk by itself, that's not true, right? We know that. We know there's someone controlling it. So that's what a satellite or puppet state is. It's a form of indirect rule. Sphere of influence this is more economically motivated. This is really only going to happen in China. So we're going to look at what happens here with China. China's going to fight a bitter war with Britain called the Opium War, which is really going to weaken them. And so they're going to be sort of have their arms twisted into doing this. So the areas here that are orange correspond with Britain, okay? So anyone who lives here has to buy British-made goods. Now, if the British are the only ones selling them, what do you think the British are going to do to the price? Raise it, right? That makes sense. So they're going to make a ton of money. They're going to rip these people off, though. So they're going to bring a lot of resentment, okay? Notice, by the way, Japan was in on this game. A lot of people don't realize that. We're going to talk about Japan and their modernization, which is pretty unreal when you look at how they go from being essentially a feudalist country with very little running water or electricity outside any cities in 1867 to the military powerhouse they are by 1911. It's an unbelievably fast transformation. So we'll look at Japan later in this unit. Okay, the partition of Africa has a lot of long-lasting effects. So we're going to talk a lot about Belgium as a case study. We're going to talk about this guy, King Leopold, and we're going to talk about this in class. I'm going to save it from this particular video because it really is a topic that deserves its own attention. So we will go over this in class, and it's a pretty horrific story. We're also going to talk about and really raise the question, why does this get 9 sentences in your world history book? You know, why is that? How does that happen? And what can we kind of say about this particular event or really this topic in general? It's an important thing to note. So we will look at that in great detail. And we'll talk about this political cartoon, which looks pretty creepy. And it kind of should, because King Leopold is not my favorite person. He's a pretty horrible human being. So we'll look at that in class. Okay, so we did this in class. We did the partition of Africa, right? And you guys saw the role that these different countries played in that meeting in 1885. So Liberia is actually going to be an interesting case. They're going to be administered by the United States. Their capital, Monrovia, is named after James Monroe. And the whole goal of Liberia was for former slaves in the U.S. to go, quote unquote, back to Africa. It's a nice try. It's really not going to do anything to stop slavery in the United States. So you'll learn more about that in U.S. history. Abyssinia, aka Ethiopia, was the country that managed to win. They fought back against the Italians and they won. And we're going to study this in depth too. And also how this is remembered in our history books and the different perspectives on that. So what are the legacies of this? I want you to think about that, because this is going to keep coming up over and over and over again in our world history class and in the news today. You know, there's some stories in the news today that we can still kind of trace back to some of the successes and failures of the decisions that were made during this time. So that's really what I want you guys to understand here. Okay, so for the sake of this particular topic, this is where we're going to end our discussion. And hopefully you have a good background on imperialism.